There are stories that remain hidden, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Jacob's fifth son was neither the favorite, nor the strongest, nor the most influential. Even so, his journey was marked by failure, repentance, and a divine calling that would transform the destiny of an entire tribe, leaving a legacy that echoes to this day. In the history of Israel, what led a man born almost in silence to become a symbol of justice and leadership? Today, we will dive into a powerful narrative, a journey of struggle, fall, and redemption that not only surprises, but also transforms the way we understand the true meaning of leadership. But before we continue, remember, subscribe and share this content. Stories like this carry lessons that deserve to reach more people. Let us return to the heart of Canaan. Under a deep blue sky by day and illuminated by countless stars at night, a child was born whose life would be marked by the duality between blessing and challenge. He was Jacob's fifth son and the firstborn of Bilhah, the servant given by Rachel to her husband amid the suffering caused by her barrenness. Jacob, patriarch of a lineage destined to fulfill divine promises, lived emotionally divided. His love for Rachel was intense and sincere, but his household was marked by constant tension with Leah, his first wife, and Rachel's older sister. The rivalry between the two went beyond emotion and deeply influenced the family environment, affecting not only Jacob, but also how each child was seen and treated. It was within this context of silent conflict that he came into the world. His birth was celebrated by Rachel, who declared, "God has vindicated me, he has heard my voice." Thus the name Dan emerged, judge, or God has judged, sealing from the very beginning a singular destiny. From an early age, Dan grew up amid comparisons and disputes. Joseph, also Rachel's son, was clearly Jacob's favorite, a fact that fueled tensions among the brothers, especially between Leah's sons and those born to the servants Bilhah and Zilpah. The family atmosphere was marked by hidden rivalries and restrained emotions. Observant and prudent, Dan learned early to analyze before acting. He was a quiet child, watchful-eyed, who preferred to understand the events around him before taking any action. He perceived that behind smiles and friendly appearances were hidden envy, pain, and deep frustrations. Rachel, though loved by Jacob, carried the humiliation of prolonged infertility. For her, motherhood was a matter of honor and redemption. Leah, on the other hand, though she had borne several sons, lived with the pain of not possessing her husband's heart. In this complex setting, each birth represented more than the arrival of a child. It was also a symbol of rivalry, hope, and affirmation. Jacob's sons did not merely grow up, they were prepared as future leaders of the tribes that would form Israel. Each carried the expectation of the promises God had made to their father, descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and as the sand of the sea. For Dan, however, this expectation carried a special weight. He was neither the firstborn, nor the favorite, nor the strongest among his brothers. He occupied a middle position, searching for his place, his identity, and his purpose. As he grew, his personality began to stand out. Unlike Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, known for their strength and impulsiveness, Dan showed an inclination toward justice and reflection. Even as a young boy, he mediated small disputes among shepherds and sought to preserve peace amid daily chaos. His name began to gain meaning among those around him. He became a symbol of balance, discernment, and wisdom. Dan spent long hours beside Naphtali, his brother through their mother. United by the same origin and circumstances, they shared dreams and reflections about the future. As sons of a servant, they knew what it meant to live on the margins of preference and rivalry, and this strengthened a deep bond between them. In their simple conversations, they spoke of a time when all of Jacob's sons would live in harmony, free from the rivalries that had marked their childhood. They dreamed of unity, justice, and purpose. Little did they know that Dan's destiny would lead him precisely along that path. Despite the rivalries that separated them, Jacob's camp was a place of intense activity. The tents of the patriarchs blended with the flocks of sheep and goats, composing a landscape of constant movement, accompanied by the songs of shepherds and the murmur of women in their daily tasks. It was in this vibrant setting that Dan began to forge his identity. Although his life was surrounded by uncertainties, there was one undeniable truth. From his birth, destiny seemed to hold a special plan for him. His name carried a profound meaning, far beyond what he could understand in childhood. Dan, Judge. Not merely a title, but a responsibility. Even as a boy, this calling revealed itself in small gestures, in his willingness to listen, in his effort to act with balance, in his sincere desire to be just. There was in him a natural inclination toward impartiality, a sensitivity that led him to weigh matters carefully before acting. Yet alongside these virtues, there was a silent restlessness, the awareness of a vocation he did not yet know how to name. Thus his early years passed, amid family tensions and divine promises hovering over Jacob's household. Dan was still a child, but his spirit was already taking shape. Deep within, he felt that his life carried a greater purpose, even if the path toward it would be arduous. The future remained wrapped in mystery, but Dan was not afraid. He knew his place among Jacob's sons was secure, and that, in due time, his true destiny would be revealed. His life unfolded under the same sun that illuminated the days of labor and the moments of quiet reflection, when, away from the eyes of others, he learned to understand himself and the world around him. There were constant tensions among Jacob's sons in the camp. Each child grew up immersed in a complex environment where emotions seemed hidden beneath daily routine, yet were always on the verge of overflowing. Though he was still only a boy, Dan quickly realized that the atmosphere was marked by subtle differences, awkward silences, and a favoritism no one dared to openly declare, yet everyone could feel. Among the brothers, Joseph held an apparently unreachable position. He was Rachel's beloved son, Jacob's favorite. His beauty, his charisma, and above all, the way his father treated him set him apart from an early age. The richly ornamented robe made visible what had long been silently understood. Joseph was special in Jacob's eyes. Dan felt the inevitable sting of resentment, not because he was the oldest or the most impulsive, but simply because he was human. Even so, it was not in his nature to expose his frustrations. His reserved temperament led him to observe more than react. There was something in his gaze, in the way his dark eyes examined the world, that revealed an understanding beyond his years. Deep inside, however, a spark of competitiveness began to ignite. Dan wanted to be seen, he wanted to be recognized. Above all, he wanted to be valued for who he was. His relationship with Naphtali, his brother through their mother, became a refuge amid the family's complexity. Naphtali was more outgoing, possessing a contagious energy that complemented Dan's reflective spirit. Together, they wandered through the fields, tended the flocks, and spent long moments contemplating the horizon. Between them, there was trust. They shared a silent understanding of what it meant to be sons of Bilhah, a position that placed them on the margins of the family hierarchy. The older brothers, especially Reuben and Simeon, often made a point of reminding them of their status as sons of Leah, Jacob's first wife. It was not an explicit exclusion, but their words and attitudes carried subtleties that Dan clearly perceived. During childish arguments or even playful moments, comments would arise that reminded them of their origin. "Sons of a servant should be used to obeying," one of the brothers once said jokingly. The words fell upon Dan like a stone. Naphtali reacted quickly, responding with a defiant smile. Dan, however, remained silent. Instead of replying, he withdrew into reflection, a typical response for his personality. That night, beneath the star-filled sky, he wondered whether he would ever build a name that transcended his origins. Despite the shadows that marked his childhood, there was also light. Dan showed special attention to the small details of daily life. He was skilled at mediating disputes among the younger brothers and at finding practical solutions to simple problems. His ability to remain calm in tense situations was noticed by Jacob on a few occasions, earning him subtle gestures of recognition, though always overshadowed by the favoritism shown to Joseph. In silence, Dan developed a deep sense of justice. He did not seek revenge for the differences he perceived, but balance. He often helped the camp servants, making sure they had enough water or that their tasks were not neglected. Though such actions went unnoticed by most, for him they were a way of affirming who he was, beyond the labels imposed upon him. His relationship with Jacob, though distant in many ways, had moments of connection. On quiet nights, when the warm breeze brushed against the tents, the patriarch would gather his sons to tell stories of his youth, of the promises God had made to him, and of the dreams he nurtured for his descendants. Dan listened attentively, imagining how he might contribute to that great purpose. But doubt persisted in his heart. How could a servant's son, someone born on the margins of Jacob's primary affection, influence the destiny of Israel? Over time, he began to understand that his position, though challenging, granted him a unique perspective. He did not bear the weight of the firstborn's expectations, nor the pressure of being the favorite. His place allowed him to observe, to learn, and to prepare. Without realizing it, these qualities would prove essential for the role he was destined to fulfill. Thus passed the years of his childhood, marked by the contrast between the shadows of favoritism and flashes of hope. Small in stature, yet possessing a quiet strength, Dan shaped his character while Jacob's camp continued its course, suspended between human tensions and divine promises. And as he grew, so too did his ability to perceive deeply the dynamics of power around him. What in childhood had been only a vague discomfort became increasingly clear. The favoritism, the taunts, and the authority exercised by the older brothers were shaping not only the present, but the future of that family. Dan watched and learned. They did not merely trouble him, they awakened within him a desire for change that he could not yet fully express. Jacob's camp was a microcosm of tensions. Leah's sons, led by Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, often carried themselves with an air of superiority that the sons of the servants could not ignore. Meanwhile, Joseph, with his richly ornamented robe and the dreams that so irritated the others, seemed to live in a separate sphere, sheltered by Jacob's unconditional affection. In that environment, Dan began to notice patterns that concerned him. The rules were not the same for everyone, and the most vulnerable, the servants, the women, and the younger ones, seemed to bear the weight of the decisions and whims of the stronger. One day, while Dan was helping a shepherd lead the sheep to a nearby watering place, he heard a heated argument. It was one of his older brothers, Simeon, harshly rebuking the shepherd for a trivial mistake. The man, whose age and appearance revealed years of hard labor, tried to explain that a sheep had escaped because of a wolf prowling the area. But Simeon, impatient and frustrated, refused to listen. He raised his hand, threatening to strike him to assert his authority. Dan, watching from a distance, felt a surge of indignation and, without thinking, ran toward them. He placed himself between the shepherd and his brother. His heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "Simeon, enough. This isn't necessary." Simeon looked at him first with surprise, then with anger. He was not used to being challenged by someone younger, much less by Dan, who rarely spoke up. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" he shot back, scorn and menace in his voice. "Do you think you can judge me?" Dan swallowed hard, but did not retreat. He remembered Jacob's words, the stories of justice and balance his father told on quiet nights. "I'm not judging you, Simeon. I'm only saying this isn't right. If we want respect, we must show it as well." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Simeon hesitated, perhaps because he did not expect such courage from his brother, or perhaps because Dan's words struck deeper than he cared to admit. Grumbling, he turned and walked away, leaving the shepherd and Dan alone. The man, still trembling, thanked him with a slight nod before returning to his work. Dan felt a mixture of emotions: pride for having defended what he believed was just, and concern, knowing his action would not be easily forgotten by his older brothers. That night, as he gazed at the stars, he reflected on what had happened. He knew his intervention would not immediately change the family's dynamics. Yet there was something within him he could not ignore: a calling, a sense of purpose aligned with the meaning of his name. He began to understand that his name was not merely a word, but a burden and a direction for his life. From then on, Dan paid even closer attention to the details. He watched the servants carry out their tasks in silence, almost without recognition. He noticed how the older brothers imposed their will when it was unnecessary, and how the younger ones rarely had the chance to express their thoughts. Small memories accumulated in his mind like pieces of a larger puzzle. Naphtali, ever perceptive, noticed the change in his brother one afternoon as they rested beneath a tree after tending the flocks. "I saw what you did with Simeon," Naphtali said, breaking the silence. "It was brave, but also dangerous. He's not someone who forgets easily." "I know," Dan replied calmly, "but I couldn't stand by. It's not right to treat others that way. If we are a family, we should act with justice." Naphtali smiled slightly, admiring his brother's resolve. Though he did not always share the same concerns, he knew there was something special in Dan, something the others had not yet seen. The incident with Simeon marked a turning point. Even at a young age, Dan began to take on the role of mediator in small disputes. His ability to listen to both sides and offer balanced solutions led others to seek his counsel. Without realizing it, he was beginning to fulfill the meaning of his name. Still, Dan knew this path would not be easy. He lived in a world where strength and position seemed to matter more than justice. Yet in his heart, a seed of hope began to grow. He believed that with God's help, he could make a difference. His dream of justice, still only a glimpse, began to take shape on the horizon of his life. The day Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers was etched into Dan's soul like a wound, a memory that would follow him like a shadow for years. The atmosphere in the camp had already been heavy with tension and resentment, especially toward Joseph, Jacob's favored son. But what happened that day marked a point of no return for all of Jacob's sons. And for Dan, it ignited an inner struggle that would never find complete comfort. It began with what seemed like an ordinary task. Jacob had sent Joseph to look for his older brothers, who were tending the flocks in distant lands. The order was not unusual, but Joseph's presence, wrapped in his colorful robe, immediately stirred jealousy and anger in his brothers' hearts. Dan, alongside Naphtali, watched from a distance as tensions gathered like storm clouds before a tempest. "Here he comes again," Simeon muttered with contempt, fixing his gaze on Joseph. "With his dreams and his arrogance, thinking he's better than us." "That's enough," Levi added, his voice low but laced with venom. "How long will we put up with this?" A chill ran through Dan as he heard those words. Though he did not share his brother's hatred, he also did not feel able to defend Joseph openly. He had learned to choose his battles, and this seemed like one where reason would be crushed by fury. Events unfolded quickly. When Joseph arrived, his brothers surrounded him and violently stripped him of his robe. Confused, he tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by accusations and insults. Dan watched from the periphery, feeling powerless as the situation escalated. Then Reuben, the eldest, intervened. Though resentful himself, he did not wish to shed blood. "Let us not kill him," he said firmly. "Throw him into that empty cistern and leave him there." The proposal was accepted with a simple nod. Joseph, struggling against his brothers as he pleaded for his life, was dragged to the cistern and thrown inside. Dan watched in silence, his mind divided between duty and fear. He knew it was wrong, but the weight of his brother's pressure kept him still, imprisoned by his own hesitation. Hours later, while they were still deciding what to do, a group of Ishmaelite merchants appeared on the horizon and stopped nearby. Then Judah presented an even darker proposal. "What do we gain by letting Joseph die in that cistern?" he asked, looking at the others shrewdly. "Let's sell him to these merchants. That way we get rid of him without getting blood on our hands." The words fell heavily upon the group. Dan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Despite the evident discomfort, no one objected. Minutes later, Joseph was lifted out of the cistern. His face was marked by despair as he realized his own brothers were negotiating his price as if he were an object. When the merchants led him away, Joseph cast one last look at Dan. It was brief, but profound. Dan felt as though that look asked something of him, a word, a gesture, any action at all. But he remained silent. When it was over and the brothers gathered again, the silence that enveloped them was thick and unsettling. The brothers decided to cover up the crime with a lie. They stained Joseph's robe with blood and presented it to Jacob, convincing him that a wild beast had devoured his son. Dan could not look any of them in the eye. Guilt suffocated him, tightening around his chest with crushing force. That night, he sought out Naphtali, his closest companion. Sitting beneath the star-filled sky, the darkness seemed to mirror the weight of what they had done. "How did we let this happen?" Dan whispered, his voice breaking. "Joseph was our brother, our own brother." Naphtali, who had also remained silent throughout the ordeal, sighed deeply before answering. "I know," he said, regret in his voice, "but you felt that hatred, that fury. It was as if no one could stop them." Dan lowered his gaze. He knew it was true, but it brought him no comfort. He stared at the horizon and wondered whether the God of his father was watching everything they had done. Would he ever be able to forgive his brothers? And harder still, would he be able to forgive himself? "I always knew we weren't a perfect family," Naphtali continued, "but today I wonder if we are truly meant to remain united, to become the tribes of Israel. How can we be the chosen people after something like this?" Dan remained silent. His conscience consumed him from within. That night, he made a silent vow, though he did not know whether he would have the strength to fulfill it. If he were ever given the opportunity, he would do everything in his power to repair the harm that had been done. He would be better. He would be just. He would truly become a judge among his people. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a season in which guilt and repentance became constant companions. While the camp slept, Dan remained awake, gazing at the stars and wondering whether he would ever find redemption. He did not know how or when, but deep in his heart, he knew he could not ignore the call of justice echoing within him. As time passed, the memory of that day became a heavy burden. Though his brothers seemed to move on, taking refuge in the routines of the camp and the care of the flocks, Dan found no peace. At night, while conversations filled with forced laughter around the fire, he remained distant, as if trapped in a nightmare from which he could not awaken. His withdrawal did not go unnoticed. The older brothers, accustomed to leading with authority, began to see him as withdrawn, perhaps even weak. But for Dan, it was something deeper. He felt separated from them, as if the bond that once united them had been irreparably broken. The betrayal of Joseph had opened a chasm between them, and Dan did not know how to cross it. As the days passed, that distance deepened. Conversations with Naphtali, once a source of comfort, became less frequent. Though his brother understood part of the weight Dan carried, he seemed unable to ease his pain. Dan, in turn, chose silence. It was easier to bear the regret alone than to face the looks that reminded him of his omission. His conflict was not merely emotional, it was spiritual. Jacob often spoke of God's promises, of the covenants and visions he had received. But to Dan, those words began to sound hollow. How could he consider himself part of a chosen lineage if he had remained silent in the face of such injustice? How could he reconcile himself with God after allowing evil to prevail? One night, unable to bear the weight any longer, Dan left the camp and walked to a nearby clearing. There, under the starry sky, he knelt and let the tears flow. For the first time in a long while, he allowed his heart to speak. "God of my father Jacob," he murmured, his voice trembling, "how can I be worthy of your promises? I failed. I remained silent when I should have spoken. I allowed injustice to prevail. How can I find my way back?" At first, the desert answered with silence. Then a gentle breeze touched his face. In his mind, a clear image formed, a perfectly balanced scale. He heard no words, but felt a deep certainty. The scale was not broken. Balance could still be restored. Though he had failed, he was not condemned to live forever in guilt. That realization ignited a flame of hope within him. It was not an immediate solution, nor did it erase the past, but it was enough to remind him that the path of justice remains open to those willing to walk it. That night, for the first time in a long while, Dan slept with a measure of peace, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. From then on, he began to reflect more deeply on his role within the family and within the promise given to Jacob. Instead of focusing solely on his mistake, he chose to concentrate on what he could still do. Though he maintained some distance from his brothers, he began to act more intentionally, helping the servants, defending the younger ones when they were treated unjustly, and ensuring that tasks were distributed fairly. Small actions, but for Dan, each one was a step toward redemption. Though modest, these acts gave him renewed purpose. Still, the shadow of guilt lingered. There were nights when images of Joseph being led away by the merchants woke him in a cold sweat. In those moments, Dan would return to prayer, asking for guidance and strength to move forward. Even when clear answers did not come, each prayer drew him closer to the conviction that his life still carried a greater purpose. One day, while tending the flocks in a distant region, he had an experience that marked his journey. Watching the sheep, he noticed one stray from the flock and become entangled among thorns. Though it was a common sight, something made him pause and look more closely. Instead of rushing immediately to rescue it, he watched as it struggled to free itself. When he realized it could not manage alone, he approached and gently set it free. As he carried it back, he felt an unexpected connection between that moment and his own life. Just as the sheep had needed help to return to safety, he too needed guidance. But he understood something even deeper. His role was not only to seek his own redemption, but to help others find theirs. With this new perspective, Dan began to see his distance from his brothers, not as rejection, but as an opportunity to observe, to learn, and to prepare. Though he still carried the weight of the past, he started to look toward the future with renewed hope. He knew the path of redemption would be long and filled with challenges, but he chose to walk it step by step. The years of silence were not easy, but they shaped him in ways he did not yet fully understand. They were preparing him for a purpose he could not yet clearly see, but was beginning to sense. His heart still bore the scars of betrayal, yet it was also filled with conviction. The call to justice, inscribed in his name, was a path he could still walk, and he would do so with all the strength of his spirit. It began as just another ordinary mission. Jacob sent Dan and Naphtali to seek new pastures, since the lands near the camp were becoming increasingly exhausted. It was a routine task for Jacob's sons, but Dan saw in these journeys something beyond duty. There was something about the vastness of the desert that drew him, as if the winds and sands held answers to the questions he carried in his heart. One afternoon, while guiding the sheep through a valley beyond the hills, they spotted a different camp in the distance. The tents were adorned with vibrant colors and geometric patterns that stood out against the arid landscape. Nearby, men and women worked diligently, repairing carts and tending animals. They were Midianites, a nomadic tribe known for their caravans that crossed the desert transporting spices, fabrics, and other goods. They were not entirely unknown, but they rarely crossed paths with Jacob and his sons. Curiosity stirred within Dan. His instinct told him to approach. Naphtali noticed his hesitation and encouraged him. Though reluctant, Dan agreed. As they neared the camp, an older man came forward to meet them. His grey beard fell to his chest, and his attentive eyes bore the mark of experience. His face revealed serenity, but also caution, like someone accustomed to observing before trusting. With cautious yet reserved hospitality, Dan inclined his head slightly in a gesture of respect. "We are shepherds seeking pasture for our flocks," he said calmly. "We saw your camp from afar and would like to rest a while before continuing our journey." The man studied them for a long moment before nodding. "If you come in peace, you will be welcome," he finally replied. "I am Heta, one of the elders of this tribe. You will find refuge among us." Dan and Naphtali were invited to share a simple meal with the Midianites. As time passed, Dan began to notice something different about the dynamics of that community. Though hierarchies existed, decisions seemed to be made by consensus. The elders acted more as counselors than as rulers. There was a balance there that stood in sharp contrast to the constant tensions within his own family. In the days that followed, they remained with the Midianites, for the flocks needed rest and there was abundant water in the region. Ever observant, Dan paid close attention to the tribe's customs. Heta, noticing his interest, drew near and began sharing stories and traditions of his people. "In our tribe, leadership is not based on strength, but on wisdom and justice," Heta explained one evening as they sat by the fire. "A good leader does not impose his will. He listens, understands, and seeks what is best for everyone." Dan absorbed each word like drops of water in the desert. Heta's teachings resonated deeply within him, affirming something he had always felt but had never been able to articulate clearly. One afternoon, Dan witnessed a judgment within the camp. A man had been accused of stealing provisions, and the tribe gathered to resolve the conflict. Instead of punishing him immediately, the elders patiently listened to both the accused and his accusers. Then they deliberated, not to determine who was stronger or more influential, but to find a solution that would bring justice and restore peace. In the end, the man was forgiven, on the condition that he return what he had taken and work for a time to compensate for his wrongdoing. Dan was deeply impressed. This was not a justice rooted merely in punishment, but in reconciliation. That night, he spoke again with Heta. "How do you maintain this balance?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. "In my family, disputes are often resolved by force or silence, but never with such clarity." Heta smiled serenely. "Because we understand that justice is not merely punishment, young shepherd. It is restoration. It is seeking what is right not only for the individual, but for the whole community. A judge must not be a tyrant, but a servant. The scales of justice are always in motion, and our task is to keep them balanced." Those words were engraved upon Dan's heart. During his time with the Midianites, he continued learning, not only about justice, but also about humility and leadership. He came to understand that being a judge among his people did not simply mean making correct decisions, but becoming an example of fairness and compassion. When the time came to depart, Heta called him aside and handed him a small object, a smooth, rounded stone engraved with an ancient symbol. "It is a sign of balance," the elder said. "Carry it with you as a reminder that true justice does not revolve around you, but around others." Dan received the gift with gratitude. Alongside Naphtali, he began the journey back to Jacob's camp, reflecting on all he had learned. His time among the Midianites had planted a seed in his heart, a seed that was beginning to blossom into renewed purpose. He now understood that his role as judge was not merely destiny, but responsibility. The time in the desert had shown him that he could transcend the shadows of the past and become a leader capable of bringing balance to his people. When he returned to the camp, everything seemed the same. Tents stirred by the wind, shepherds guiding their flocks, familiar voices filling the air. Yet something within him had changed. The experience had kindled a new fire inside him. He no longer saw his place among Jacob's sons as a burden, but as an opportunity to make a difference. His return was not marked by celebration. To his brothers, Dan remained the same reserved young man, yet in the weeks that followed, subtle changes became evident. He spoke with greater firmness. His words carried an unexpected wisdom. He showed a consistent willingness to mediate conflicts and pursue fair decisions, both among his brothers and among the servants of the camp. Over time, this posture began to draw quiet respect. Even those who had once overlooked him began to recognize him as someone to whom they could turn. Without fanfare, Dan was beginning to walk the path toward becoming the judge his name had foretold. Dan did not seek prominence or a position of leadership. Even so, his balanced character and his willingness to listen to everyone made him a respected figure in the camp. Younger shepherds sought him out when conflicts arose over the flocks, and servants who often felt ignored by Jacob's older sons found in him someone willing to stand for what was right. Without realizing it, the seed of something greater was beginning to take root. Men and women began to draw near to Dan almost naturally. They saw in him an example of justice and compassion and began to identify themselves as part of his circle. It was not yet a formal tribe, but the bonds among those people grew stronger with every balanced decision he made. Even Naphtali, his closest companion, noticed the transformation. "I don't know what you learned among the Midianites," he said one night as they shared a fire, "but it's as if you've found something the rest of us still can't see." Dan smiled faintly, watching the flames dance before them. "I didn't find anything new, Naphtali. It was always within me. I just needed someone to show me how to use it." But not everything was harmonious. As the group around Dan grew, so did the tensions. Some of his brothers began to see him as a subtle threat, especially Simeon and Levi, who were accustomed to imposing authority. The respect Dan was beginning to earn seemed to challenge, even if indirectly, the dominance they exercised within the family. One day, while Dan was speaking with shepherds about distributing tasks, Simeon abruptly interrupted. "Since when do you decide how things work here?" he asked with disdain. "Do you think you're a leader just because some servants follow you like sheep?" Dan remained calm. He neither raised his voice nor showed irritation. He simply looked at his brother and answered serenely, "I do not intend to lead anyone. I only do what I believe is right. If anyone walks beside me, it is because they share the same purpose, not because I demand it." The response silenced Simeon for a moment, but the tension lingered in the air. Judah and Zebulun watched closely, curious to see how far this growing influence around Dan would go. Beyond the conflicts with his brothers, internal challenges also arose. Not everyone who approached Dan agreed on what justice truly meant. Some argued for severe punishment when someone erred. Others favored reconciliation. Inspired by the lessons of the Midianites, Dan sought balance, but it was not always simple. On one occasion, a young shepherd was accused of stealing a sheep from the common flock. Part of the group demanded public punishment, others suggested immediate expulsion. Dan listened to both sides before making a different decision. He gathered everyone around the fire and spoke directly to the young man. "Why did you take what was not yours?" Embarrassed, the youth confessed that his family was starving and he saw no other option. Instead of condemning him, Dan proposed a restorative solution. The sheep would be returned, and the young man would work for a period assisting other shepherds. In this way, he would make amends for his mistake and ensure honest provision for his family. The decision did not please everyone. Yet over time, many recognized the value of a justice that restored rather than merely punished. As similar situations arose, the identity of the group around Dan became clearer. It was not a union based on strength or position, but on a commitment to balance and fairness. This began to attract not only servants and shepherds, but also some of Jacob's sons, who, though initially resistant, came to respect his posture. Jacob observed in silence. One night, walking beside Dan through the camp, he expressed his surprise. "I never imagined that you, my reserved son, would be the one to bring balance to this family." There was admiration in his voice, and also a trace of reflection. Dan answered humbly, "I do not do this to be recognized, my father. I do it because I believe it is what God expects of me." And in that moment, Jacob realized that his quiet son was indeed beginning to become the judge his name had foretold. If I can establish justice in this place, then my existence will have found its meaning. The development of the tribe of Dan did not happen quickly or peacefully. It was a process marked by hardships, internal conflicts, and seasons of doubt. Even so, he remained steadfast in his purpose. Gradually, those around him stopped seeing him merely as one of Jacob's sons and began to recognize him as someone called to lead, a judge committed to the common good. As the group became more established, Dan began to understand that his calling was not to rule alone, but to teach his people that justice is not a destination. It is not a trophy to be won, but a continuous path to be walked. And though many challenges still lay ahead, he was determined to move forward with the same conviction that had been born in the desert when he learned from the Midianites. Time had passed, leaving visible marks on Jacob's face. His steps had grown slower, and his voice carried the weight of decades of experiences, fulfilled promises, and inevitable failures. He was a man who had lived under divine blessing, but also under the shadow of his own conflicts. Now, in old age, he sensed that the moment to pass on his legacy was approaching. Jacob summoned his sons. They gathered beneath the starry sky, while fires flickered in the darkness, casting shadows across the faces of the 12 men who represented the future of Israel. The atmosphere was solemn, heavy with expectation, and for some, with apprehension. Seated, Jacob looked at them one by one. "My sons," he said in a deep yet calm voice, "the days of my journey are drawing to an end. Before I depart, I must speak about your destiny and that of your descendants. Each of you has a role in the plan of the Most High, a function in the legacy promised to our house." The brothers listened in silence. The words that followed were not simple praises nor mere rebukes. They were prophetic declarations. They revealed virtues and frailties alike. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, each received his portion of truth, mixed with warnings and blessings. When it was Dan's turn, Jacob lifted his gaze with intensity. There was pride there, but also gravity. "Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel," he declared. "He shall be a serpent by the roadside, a viper along the path, that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backward." Those words pierced deep into his soul. They were both promise and mystery. Dan felt the immediate weight of the declaration, as though he had been given a charge he would need his entire life to understand. Jacob continued, his tone now more severe. "But guard yourself, my son. The role of judge can produce justice, but it can also lead to pride. If you allow power to cloud your discernment, you will lose your mission, and with it, the balance you are meant to bring to your people." Dan bowed his head, absorbing every word. There were no simple answers in that prophecy, only a path that would demand prudence and steadfastness. After blessing each son, the gathering dispersed. Yet the weight of Jacob's words lingered in the air. While the others withdrew, Dan remained alone under the night sky. In his hands, he turned the smooth stone he had received from the Midianite elder. "Judge of my people," he murmured, "and also a serpent." How could he be both? He knew that justice was like a sharpened blade. It could protect or wound. He had already seen how the desire to impose order could turn into oppression when not tempered by humility. The warning against pride echoed in his mind. Even noble intentions could become corrupted. As he reflected, a question formed clearly. What does it truly mean to be a judge? Over time, he had come to understand that it was not merely about deciding disputes or administering punishment. To be a judge was to guard balance. It was to place the common good above personal interest. It was to accept difficult decisions, even when misunderstood. He remembered the lessons of the Midianites, leadership that served, not dominated. "It does not belong to you," the old elder had said. "Justice belongs to God. You are only the instrument." That memory reshaped his understanding. His calling was not to exalt his own name, but to fulfill a purpose greater than himself. But he knew this would require more than good intentions. It would demand constant faith, discernment, courage, and above all, humility. As the hours passed, Dan began to map out in his mind how he might exercise his role without straying from it. He understood that he must surround himself with people who shared the same vision, men and women committed to justice, not driven by ambition or the thirst for power. He also recognized that he needed to remain firm in his faith, seeking God's direction to face the dark days that would inevitably come. Under the whisper of the wind among the tents, Dan made a silent vow. Though the path might be arduous, he would do everything within his power to be the judge his people needed. He would not allow pride to rule him. He would not let the scales tip toward personal interest. If he was destined to be a serpent by the roadside, it would be to protect, never to destroy. As he returned to his tent, he carried not only the weight of the prophecy, but also renewed clarity. He knew trials would come, and he was willing to face them with the same conviction that had guided him since the desert. He could not foresee the future, but he trusted that each just decision would bring him closer to fulfilling the legacy Jacob had proclaimed. The land the tribe of Dan began to claim was fertile, adorned with green valleys and gentle hills that promised prosperity. Yet that very abundance attracted the attention of the Philistines, a powerful and warlike nation, famous for their military skill and mastery of iron weapons. For Dan and his people, this would be the first great test of unity and strength. And so, the conflict began. After minor clashes along the borders, groups of Philistines began appearing in neighboring lands, demanding tribute from shepherds and plundering the resources of the more vulnerable settlements. Tension rose quickly, and the elders of the village sought Dan for guidance. Standing before the crowd that gathered, he spoke calmly but firmly. "We will not pay tribute to those who oppress us. This land has been granted to us. If the Philistines wish to confront us, let them come. We will not surrender." Aware that conflict was inevitable, Dan began organizing his people. They were not a trained army, but among them were brave men and women willing to protect what was theirs. He gathered the most capable to form a strategic council. Ezra stood out as a natural leader, skilled in coordinating large groups. Tamar, courageous and perceptive, was known for her precision with the bow. Abiram, a young blacksmith, began forging simple weapons, preparing the tribe for what was to come. Gathered in a tent at the edge of the camp, they discussed strategies. "The Philistines are more numerous and better armed," Dan said, studying the faces before him. "We cannot defeat them in open battle, but we know this land better than they do. We will use that to our advantage." In the days that followed, intense preparations took hold of the tribe. Patrols were organized, supplies hidden at strategic points, and traps set in the narrow passes of the hills. Every member of the tribe, regardless of age or strength, was given a role in the defense. The attack did not delay. One morning, Philistine war chariots advanced toward the main settlement. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their iron wheels, and the sight was intimidating. Yet Dan and his people were ready. When the chariots reached a narrow passage between two hills, they fell into the first trap. Branches and stones, carefully positioned, jammed the wheels and disrupted the enemy's formation. From above, archers led by Tamar released a rain of arrows. At the same time, Ezra and his warriors attacked from the flanks. Dan, positioned on higher ground, monitored every movement, ensuring no one acted impulsively amid the chaos. "Stand united!" he shouted. "Fight as one body!" The confrontation lasted for hours. Strategy and courage prevailed. Surprised by the unexpected resistance, the Philistines retreated, abandoning damaged chariots and wounded men. After the battle, the people gathered around a great fire. Though victory brought relief, Dan knew it was only the beginning. His face still marked by the strain of the day, he addressed the tribe. "Today we proved that courage and unity make us strong. We are not a scattered group. We are a family that stands firm. We did not yield to fear nor submit to oppression. But we must remain prepared. This was only the beginning. They will return, and we must be ready to face them with the same determination." His words were met with applause, and with the quiet awareness that difficult times still lay ahead. In the days that followed, Dan worked to strengthen his position even further. He formed alliances with other nomadic families in the region, offering protection in exchange for future support. These agreements expanded the tribe's strength, but they also introduced new internal challenges. Not everyone was comfortable with the path being taken. A small group, led by a man named Malchi, began to openly question the confrontational stance. "Why not negotiate?" he asked in an assembly. "Why risk our lives for a land we could share in peace?" Dan listened carefully before replying, "I understand your fear, Malchi, but negotiating under threat will not give us peace. It will make us dependent. This land is not merely soil, it is promise. We must protect it, not only for ourselves, but for those who will come after us." Though not everyone was convinced, the majority reaffirmed their trust in his leadership. Dan understood that internal divisions could be just as dangerous as external enemies. For that reason, he invested time in strengthening the community's bonds, promoting dialogue and unity. The conflict with the Philistines marked a decisive point. The tribe of Dan not only demonstrated an ability to defend itself, but began to consolidate its identity as a people united by commitment to justice and resistance. Despite the hardships, Dan felt increasingly secure in his role as leader and judge. He knew the shadows had not vanished, but he also believed his people had the strength and determination to face them together. In his heart, Dan lifted a prayer of gratitude to the Lord for guiding his steps to that point, and he pleaded for discernment for the days ahead. The path forward was still uncertain, but he carried the conviction that his tribe would leave a deep mark on Israel's history. Up to that moment, his leadership had been sustained by a delicate balance between justice, strategy, and commitment to the people. Yet even the most prudent judges fail, and Dan would be no exception. His journey led him into difficult decisions, and though he always sought what was best for his people, an error in judgment nearly cost them everything. After the victory against the Philistines, the tribe found itself strengthened. Then a new challenge arose. Groups of nomads, also persecuted by the Philistines, began drawing near to their lands. They came in small bands, asking for shelter and offering loyalty in exchange for protection. Over time, however, their numbers grew considerably, stirring unease within the community. Wishing to preserve stability and move by compassion, Dan decided to receive them, believing they could be integrated and strengthen the tribe. He ignored, however, the warnings of leaders such as Ezra, who sensed that some of the newcomers showed little respect for local customs. Dan's intention was noble, but he lacked vigilance. Conflicts soon emerged. Resources began to run thin. Some refugees started taking provisions without consent, and then the worst came to light. A faction among them was secretly collaborating with the Philistines, passing along information about the tribe's defenses. The betrayal culminated in a surprise attack that nearly destroyed the main settlement. After the clash, Dan walked among damaged tents and downcast faces. Guilt consumed him. He had trusted without proper precautions, and now his people were paying the price. That night, he withdrew to the edge of the camp. He sat alone, unable to meet the eyes of those who had placed their trust in him. For the first time since taking leadership, he doubted himself. "I have failed my people," he murmured, his voice heavy. "How can I call myself a judge if my decisions bring pain instead of justice?" As he sat there, wrapped in discouragement, he felt a hand rest upon his shoulder. It was Heta, the old Midianite, who years earlier had taught him his first lessons in leadership. He was passing through the camp on business, but when he heard what had happened, he sought out his former student. "I see in your eyes a burden you cannot carry alone," the elder said, sitting beside him. "Tell me, what troubles you?" Dan opened his heart. He recounted his decision to welcome the refugees, the lack of supervision, and the disaster that followed. Heta listened attentively. "Yes, you made a mistake. he said calmly. But leadership is not the same as infallibility. It is the ability to learn from failures and rise after a fall. The question is not whether you failed, but what you will do from here. Dan remained silent, absorbing the words. Remember, Heta continued, the scales of justice are not perfect because men are not perfect. What matters is seeking to rebalance them. Acknowledge your error, seek God, and allow him to guide you. Those words rekindled something in Dan. The guilt did not vanish, but it was transformed into an impulse to grow. The next day, he gathered the entire tribe. Without excuses, he publicly acknowledged his failure. I did not protect you as I should have, he declared honestly. I erred by trusting without vigilance, but this mistake will not define who we are. We will learn from it, and we will become stronger. Dan's sincerity brought hope to the people. United, they began to rebuild what had been destroyed, reinforce their defenses, and reorganize their internal structure. The remaining refugees were assessed with strict scrutiny. The loyal stayed, the suspicious were expelled. That episode marked a transformation in his leadership. Dan began to act with even greater humility, seeking divine guidance before every important decision. Guilt became a constant reminder, not a paralyzing weight, but a warning that kept him vigilant. In time, the tribe not only healed from the attack's wounds, but emerged stronger. They learned that faith and humility could turn defeat into growth. Dan remained at the front, not as a perfect judge, but as a man willing to learn, correct, and serve. Yet the desert wind carried new omens. Humiliated by their earlier defeats, the Philistines prepared for a decisive assault. The tension in the camp was visible, but this time Dan did not allow insecurity to master him. He was no longer the inexperienced leader who feared his own decisions. He had faced his mistakes and strengthened his faith. When news of the Philistine advance arrived, it struck like a heavy blow. This time, they did not intend merely to plunder, they meant to destroy. They came with reinforced war chariots, more numerous soldiers, and better weapons than ever before. Dan immediately summoned the tribe's leaders. We will not face this alone, he declared firmly. The alliances we have cultivated over the years will not be abandoned now. It is time to call them to fight at our side. Calmly, Dan let his gaze pass over each person present before speaking. This land is ours by divine promise. We will not hand it over to those who wish to take it, but we will not win by brute strength. We will fight with wisdom, faith, and unity. He divided the people into groups, assigning specific roles to each. They would use the terrain to its fullest. Hills, narrow ravines, and valleys became essential parts of the strategy. The accumulated knowledge of Philistine movements and vulnerabilities would be their greatest advantage. Tamar would command the archers on the heights. Ezra and his men would be responsible for neutralizing the war chariots. Dan would remain at the center of the clash, guiding the people with steadfast presence and unshakable determination. When the day of battle dawned, the camp of the tribe of Dan fell into a solemn silence. Men and women prepared, aware that victory would depend not only on strategy, but on endurance and sacrifice. Dan held the stone of balance Heta had given him years earlier. He offered a silent prayer, asking God for direction and strength. The impact was brutal. Confident in their numerical superiority, the Philistines advanced with crushing fury. But the tribe was ready. Traps in the narrow passes slowed the war chariots. From the high hills, Tamar's archers loosed successive volleys of arrows. Ezra led a group that infiltrated the enemy ranks, spreading disorder. Dan guided his warriors with contagious courage. His voice rose above the roar of battle. Do not retreat. We fight for our land, for our families, for our future. The battle raged until nightfall. Losses were severe, but strategy prevailed. Exhausted and demoralized, the Philistines began to withdraw, abandoning the field. The tribe of Dan had achieved the unlikely, defeating a stronger enemy without losing its identity. Yet the victory came at a high cost. Many of the bravest fell. among them Ezra and Tamar, who had fought with remarkable courage. Though the people celebrated the triumph, Dan felt the weight of loss like a deep wound. He walked among the fallen and stopped beside Tamar. With her last strength, she had left a message. Tell the people not to fight for revenge, but for justice. Those words echoed in Dan's heart. He understood that true triumph did not lie in the destruction of the enemy, but in the preservation of justice and unity. Days later, Dan went to Jacob's tent, now weakened by age and illness. The patriarch lay bedridden. When he saw his son, a faint smile appeared on his face. "Come, Dan," he said in a frail yet affectionate voice. "I have heard of the victory. I am proud of you." Dan knelt beside his father and took his wrinkled hand in his own. For a long time, he had felt unable to live up to his father's expectations. But in that moment, part of that weight lifted. "Father, I did what I believed was right, but I have failed many times," he confessed, allowing his vulnerability to surface. Trembling, Jacob shook his head, his eyes filled with wisdom. "My son, everyone fails. I have failed as well. It is not failure that defines a man, but what he does after it. You have learned, matured, and led your people with justice. That is your legacy, Dan." For the first time in a long while, tears filled Dan's eyes. His father's words not only comforted him, but strengthened his purpose. "Thank you, Father," Dan said. "I promise to continue leading my people with humility and justice." Jacob nodded. After a long silence, he added, "God is with you, Dan. Never forget that." Shortly after Jacob's death, Dan felt more determined than ever to honor his father's legacy and continue guiding his tribe with balance and wisdom. The peace they had managed to establish with the Philistines, though fragile, marked a turning point in the history of his people. From that moment on, the tribe of Dan became a symbol of justice and resilience, reflecting the lessons he had learned throughout his life. The scars of battle remained, as did the seeds of hope he had planted in his land. With every just decision, he reaffirmed his place in Israel's history, not as a perfect man, but as a leader who found redemption through faith, sacrifice, and perseverance. On the day Jacob died, the patriarch's tent was full. For the first time in years, the 12 brothers were gathered together, setting aside their differences to honor the man who had guided their family through divine promises and human adversities. The atmosphere was solemn. Though sorrow enveloped them all, there was also a renewed sense of purpose. With his final blessing, Jacob made clear the responsibilities of each son in the future of Israel. Standing beside Naphtali, Dan gazed at his father's serene face, recalling the words of the prophecy he had received, "You shall judge your people." Those words had guided him through the years, shaping his life and his decisions. Now, in the face of farewell, he understood that his role was not only to lead, but to build a lasting legacy. Jacob's death marked a new era for the sons of Israel. Each returned to his land and tribe, assuming the responsibilities their father had entrusted to them. Dan's task was to solidify his people's identity as a symbol of justice and balance in the promised land. As he walked through the hills of his territory, he reflected on the path that had brought him there. He had once been an insecure child, shaped by family rivalries. He had made mistakes, suffered losses, and faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. But he had also grown, learning from every fall and finding in faith the strength to rise again. He realized that his place in history would not be defined solely by victories, but by the values he had upheld. By preserving justice, humility, and compassion, the tribe of Dan prospered over time. The lands they defended became a refuge for those seeking a community built on respect and fairness. Shepherds and craftsmen worked together, building villages that reflected unity. The system of justice they established became one of the greatest hallmarks of his legacy. Inspired by his leadership, the elders formed a council to mediate disputes and ensure that each decision was made with wisdom and impartiality. Dan's words echoed in every gathering. Justice is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. The young grew up hearing stories of the battles against the Philistines and of how Dan had led with courage and discernment. Yet what most inspired the new generations were not merely his deeds, but his character. He was not remembered as a man without flaws, but as someone who faced his weaknesses with humility and found the strength to overcome them. In the final years of his life, Dan lived in a small village near the mountains where he had fought his last battle. His hair had turned white as snow, and his hands, marked by time, revealed years of effort and sacrifice. Though he no longer led actively, he remained a respected figure sought for counsel. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the hills, Dan sat upon a stone overlooking the valley where his tribe's flocks grazed. At his side was his grandson, a young boy full of questions. "Grandfather, have you ever regretted being a leader?" the child asked with sincere curiosity. Dan smiled, remembering the many times he had felt the weight of responsibility, but also the moments of victory and the lessons he had learned. In a gentle yet steady voice he replied, "Being a leader does not mean never making mistakes. It means learning from them and continuing to do what is right. Life has taught me that making mistakes is part of the journey. What matters is learning from them and moving forward. True greatness does not lie in power, but in serving others with justice and love." The child nodded. He did not yet fully understand those words, but Dan knew that one day those teachings would find their place in his heart. That night, beneath a sky filled with stars, Dan reflected one last time on his life. He did not know how much time remained to him, but he was at peace. He had fulfilled the calling God had entrusted to him. His tribe prospered, guided by the values he had labored to plant. When he finally closed his eyes, he did so with the certainty that his legacy would live on in future generations. The tribe of Dan was strong not only in number, but in spirit, a testimony to a journey marked by falls, learning, and redemption. Dan departed this world as both leader and servant, aware that the justice he had pursued was not only for his people, but also to honor the one who had called him from the beginning. Thus is established the story of Dan, the fifth son of Jacob, a man who became an inspiration to the tribes of Israel, reminding us that even amid shadows, the light of justice can shine. His journey is not merely a tale of battles, failures, and triumph, but a testimony that even those who grow up on the margins can transform their destiny. From a childhood marked by insecurity, through mistakes as a leader, to his redemption as a just and wise judge, Dan teaches us that true greatness lies not in perfection, but in the ability to learn, to serve, and to lead with humility. Dan's legacy remained alive in his tribe, a people who prospered, sustained by the pillars of justice, faith, and compassion he defended throughout his life. His story reflects the potential each of us carries to overcome challenges, find purpose, and leave a mark that transcends time. If this story has touched you, subscribe to the channel to follow more content like this. Leave your comment sharing your thoughts on Dan's life and send this video to friends and family. Together, we can continue exploring stories filled with deep lessons and values that cross generations. Thank you for your support and for walking with us on this journey.